complicated, you know, man. It's like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
Hello, everybody. This is Robo Burden. I will be your host going forward until Mr. Burden figures out his finances.
Well,
in the meantime,
there's supposed to be a deep fake of me playing.
Hello, everybody. This is Robo Burden. I will be your host going forward until Mr. Burden figures out his finances. In the meantime,
I've really ruined this now. Apparently, I can't hear it. Wow, I really stuffed that one.
I heard it. So the audience heard most of it.
Well, that's disappointing. So, for those who don't know, Luthemplaer is back on, and he is the owner of a Jay Burden deepfake bot. So now he can make me say literally anything. Yeah. And geez, it seems like again my intro is muted.
Oh, I heard it. I heard it.
Okay, good. I don't know why, but StreamYard in general is not very kind to my audio.
Sometimes when you press an audio file, it only goes through the mic channel and not the speaker channel. I don't know the technical whatnots about that. I've tried to figure out myself, but it's really annoying.
Well, I should probably dig more into that. Instead of making my podcast better, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing and complain about it. I think that's probably. But anyway, man. Obviously, I didn't just bring you on here to help me diagnose my problems with my streaming platform. I brought you on here because I heard your recent show with Charlemagne, which I thought was quite excellent. And one of the things you mentioned in that is your kind of unique perspective on creation and the origin of things, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had to just say unique. I don't like spiritual innovation. Really, it's just a medieval view that was forgotten in the post-Enlightenment era. The view I found this view in several sources in medieval texts, ranging from Catholics, like to some degree Robert Grosseteste, who I've always laughed at his name because it translates to big balls, and Luther put this view in his Genesis commentary, and I found it here and there, but essentially it's the view that yes, there is change, but it's a degeneration, and I think there's a lot of I'll present it more in thorough after your intro.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I should say where I come from on this topic. I actually don't have particularly firm beliefs on this. I'm generally of the position, and I've said this multiple times, that a lot of theology is generally just a massive waste of time. And I don't mean that as a discipline. I mean for most people. I think that a lot of it is just kind of like incredibly in-depth arguments about things that most people don't understand or particularly need to understand, myself included. And so I've kind of applied that to like the specifics of creation, right? So you're a little bit older than I am, Luthemplaer, but I kind of grew up during the new atheist era in kind of like deep red, Bible Belt country. And so this was kind of always the topic of discussion, like the 7 literal days of creation, all of this, like it just kind of burnt me out. And so I'm curious, do you think you could describe kind of the broad camps or the broad perspectives on this topic?
Yeah, and I'll also add in much as how Satan tempted Eve in the garden by playing off of things God didn't say, mixed in with things God did say. A lot of the arguments nowadays, and especially in America, it's not like there's a right side. I think everyone just basically doesn't read and has forgotten the traditions of their ancestors in this topic. There's the young Earth view, which is that the universe is 6,000 years old. And then they don't talk about anything else possible. It was created as is in the end. There's the view that the universe is 13 billion years old from raw science, secular science. There are middle of the road approaches where it's that old but God intervened, or it's that young and it looks old, and various other things like that. I've seen different arguments for this view. I'm kind of glad that people starting to realize that these are a family of views that have bits and pieces that work and bits and pieces that frankly do not. And as is typical of American politics, oftentimes people stand to the things that they can prove and just casually hand wave away the things they can't, because they have to toe the line of whatever ideology they're part of, which is kind of sad. I expect this still to get worse. Quite frankly, the young Earth view is dying out. And we'll see if that has a new comeback, but I don't know. Sorry, I got distracted by my sister yelling in the background.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think kind of, this is why I kind of found this topic distasteful, is because in many ways it didn't seem like it was an actual fight about creation. It seemed like it was a fight about, I dislike evangelical Christians, or I dislike, professors. I dislike the academia. And there was very, little, honest debate or discussion in it. And again, I think that, and I'm probably behind the ball here, but kind of like taking a more, skeptical eye towards science. The idea that science is not something that is like objectively figured out, is not something that kind of descended in a perfect form. And that realizing the same type of like politics and the same type of motivations we see in every other institution is also at play when it comes to science and academia. So I'm curious, Luthemplaer, when did you start investigating this topic?
Oh, well, I mean, I was a very bored grammar school child, and so I've been reading Genesis probably since like 3rd or 4th grade, maybe earlier. And got into reading a lot of historical sources in high school. I was brought up in I'll say a strongly French influenced Catholic high school, which means that had a certain anti Enlightenment view, which I'm very thankful for. There were always values of like, traditional values that were reinforced. Never learned French. I can read it, but I can't speak it. But I'm very appreciative that they kind of like tackled the issue honestly, and being a Catholic institution, they weren't bound to a lot of the Baptist ideologies that you see going around now, or low church ideologies, let's say, because it's not just Baptists. At the same time, the Catholics always have had that dance with the devil with regards to evolution, and have essentially fallen into an old Earth creationist view, which is sad because it's in many ways it is abandoning their unique frame from the Middle Ages in favor of whatever was the popular science. And I kind of noticed this in probably more so college, when I started realizing that frames exist, and when you adopt them, you're abandoning other ones, and so you have to kind of first establish what's the frame you want to use, what's the origin of your frame. I call this, I've never written about this, but I've said it a couple of times. I call this in the same way that there are biological genealogies, there are mimetic genealogies, and memologies, maybe. It's not just who fathered who, it's also who taught who. And if you go back and you find yourself, if you follow the origin of your ideology, and you find that you're discovering a lot of Whigs for the Whig Party people far enough back the gene pool, or the family tree rather, and Whig history is basically Satanism, self-confessed Satanism. If you read the writers at the time, then maybe you should question if it's the right view as a Christian. And in many ways, Darwinism itself, what I was taught is that it's a direct result of viewing history as a progression rather than a cycle. You can have Darwinism also without the progressive element, but Darwinism was very quickly adopted by progressives as saying, "Oh, we're going to, evolution can do no harm; it only improves." And people always forget that there are species that just haven't changed for like billions of years, or hundreds of millions of years, rather.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up, right? Because that is, I think, in many cases, the premise that people react negatively to in Darwin, right? Is this hidden kind of premise of Whig history. The idea being that, because of evolution, therefore line go up and line go up forever.
Yeah, and extinction events become these temporary delays to progress, as opposed to a totally different shift in the norm of nature. A more honest view of extinction events is that these are moments when the existing structure of reality was rearranged because it wasn't working. A good example of this, actually, everyone knows the dinosaurs, and you might wonder why do they never teach about the species before the dinosaurs, between the Permian and the Triassic. or at least there's very little teaching. That's because there were kind of already proto-mammals there, and they were dominating the planet for a couple of millions of years. And it was really only after an extinction event that the dinosaurs took over from the mammals. And because the mammals were already, more sophisticated in their biology, they didn't go extinct. They just lingered on under the development of the dinosaurs. And then, I mean, this is assuming a Darwinian frame, of course, but once you start reading into the deeper history, you start realizing it's kind of more cyclical, right? There were lizards, then there were mammals, there were lizards, there were mammals. And then once you see the pattern, you can kind of say, well, maybe this is more of a cycle, and maybe the length of that cycle is a lot shorter. I like to say the difference between range and length. You can have a range of units, but you can also question the length, or you can have like a question of length and anyway, back and forth. But supposedly life is about 3 billion years old, and it basically has for about 1 billion of those years, it's alternated back and forth between lizards and mammals, back and forth, essentially.
That's interesting. It was actually I genuinely had no idea about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're not technically mammals, but like there's currently an ongoing. You know how they reevaluated dinosaurs to look like birds, adding feathers a lot, and that's true. Like, but dinosaurs had feathers. There's now been a shift to make these proto mammals furry, as opposed to the reptilian skill that was assumed. Furry little muskrats existing before the dinosaurs kind of violates your wig view of history. And people are like, well, if it's not progressive, then why are we saying it's progressive, right? Like, anyway.
So I'm curious, right? Can you explain more specifically what you mean with that phrase, degenerative evolution? Is that just in contrast to like the wig version? Because it seems like there's a third option, which is just that things generally stay the same.
Yeah. So this is a phrase that I've to some degree extracted from Luther's Genesis commentary, but does show up in a lot of medieval views. The view primarily being that if we take a look at the God, let's look at it from theologically. God creates everything in 7 days, and then he puts a garden there with all the plants and everything. Those forms and typologies exist in that garden. And people, a lot of the lesser educated or less well-read, I should say, will just say that everything was made there at the end, nothing changed since. But of course, if you read a few more passages forward, you see that when man sinned, plants and animals also received a portion of that sin, and like the earth was infected. And the scriptures say that thorns started showing up, the animals became predatory, that the forms changed. There was an evolution, or more accurately, a devolution of the Garden of Eden. Things did not stay the same since the Garden of Eden. They were devolved, if you will. Things became more violent, more chaotic. And I would argue that this kind of shows up in the fossil record to some degree, with clearly larger, more ferocious beasts being in the past, forming and then going away. It's like there are these waves of ferocity. And if you keep reading, you see like I think someone's going to call me a heretic if I'm wrong, but like a classic example I've heard, but I can't remember if it's actually there, where like Adam was made in God's image, but Cain was made in Adam's image after he fell. And so it's not a perfect image of God. Interesting. So many people in history have regarded this as a shift towards the as a decay, if you will. If you want, I could read a section from the commentaries that I like to frequent.
Yeah, sure.
Put it somewhere here. Let me just see if I can find it. Hopefully I didn't close it. No, I didn't close it. Yes. So, where's the? Sorry, I have a lot of quotes I put in this thing.
Yeah, no worries. If you need more time,
I found it. Luther's one of the parts of Luther is like, with respect to Martin Luther before you, if you look at my individual person, I am a certain kind of new creature, because 60 years ago I had no existence. This is the common thought and judgment of the world. But the thought and judgment of God are far different. For in God's sight, I was begotten and commenced, being multiplied. God said, "God and multiply." He was multiplied immediately from the beginning of the world. When God said, "Let us make man," he then created me also, and everyone else. For whatever God willed to create, that he did create when he spoke the words. All things did not then appear, indeed, all of a sudden before existing eyes. For as the arrow or the ball from the cannon, in which the greatest velocity is attached to the works of men, is in one moment directed to its mark, and yet does not reach the mark without a certain interval of space between and time, so God rushes, as it were, by his word, from the beginning to the end of the world. For with God there is no before nor after, nor swift nor slow, but all things to his eyes are at once present. For God is simply, absolutely independent and alone and separate from all time. That's an interesting view, because it's basically saying because God's awesome, time itself is a creation, and so God's not really, he's probably not going to be concerned about timelines. If you want to be literal, sure, from God's perspective of 6,000 years, but I'm not going to assume for 3 billion years just because your science said so. There's another part where he says, this is the part where he talks about more specifically evolution, because the theory of evolution is older than Darwin, and it existed in there. So Luther says, but here skeptics and objectors will present a further question for reply. How can it be true, say they, that God made no new thing, when it is evident that the bow of heaven, the rainbow, was created in the time of Noah, and when also the Lord threatened after the fall of Adam that it should come to pass that the earth should bring forth thorns and thistles, which thorns and thistles the earth would not have brought forth had Adam not sinned. Also concerning the serpent, the same cavaliers say that the reptile ought to creep along most upright, with its head bending toward the earth. For when first created, they say it was doubtless upright, as crows and peacocks, which, this is probably coming from fossil records of dinosaurs. We readily acknowledge that this is indeed a new state of things, wrought about by the word. God therefore did not in the seventh day cease the work in every sense, but his work still, but he works still, not only in preserving the whole creation, but also in altering and new forming the creatures. Wherefore that which we said above, that God ceased on the seventh day from creating new orders of things, is not to be understood as the true absolute end of every sense of creation. He goes on to view this, that there is alteration that's documented in the Bible, and so you can't just put a freeze frame at the Garden of Eden and that's all creation, because God went in and edited things. I don't know. I'll let you think about that. I probably should bail for the bathroom real quick, but
oh yeah,
sorry.
No worries.
Let me hear your reply first, and then I'll disappear.
Yeah, sure. So, and maybe this is a bad thing to send you off on, but to me it brings up kind of an interesting concept I've heard you mention before about the nature of time, right? And that in a way, time and space are one and the same. But essentially, without having kind of a volume and a shape to it, it cannot be affected by time, right? And then when you increase, mass, obviously, in a weird way, you kind of slow time around it. And so to me, at least, right, this idea of 6,000 years or so, which, let's also be honest, is a pretty arbitrary, kind of Enlightenment type of number, right? Yeah. I think it essentially was just
I'll have more to say about that, but keep going. I'll hear your reply, and then I'll run to the bathroom and be right back.
Yeah, sure. But essentially, just this idea that one, time is the same everywhere, but also that God experiences time in the same way we do, is a very odd idea to me. It just seems like a non sequitur, And I guess that's what you were kind of getting at.
Yeah. Okay. Be right back. Entertain the guests with some thinking or comment.
Oh, yeah, sure. Again, it's good to see you guys all here, right? It's funny. I kind of had this, I think, a realization a lot of us had, is that Cringewalker or Luthemplaer here actually is an interesting person. When all you hear is the super chats, you're like, oh wow, this guy seems a little subversive. He seems a little out there. And then, all of a sudden, right, you read his Substack and you're like, oh wow, you're actually kind of smart. And it's a little bit disappointing, I'll be honest. I was kind of hoping he'd be some kind of absolute freak. But yeah, I would recommend you guys check out his stream with Charlemagne. Charlemagne has gotten his internet set up and has got about an hour and a half long talk with Luthemplaer or Cringewalker, specifically about kind of space and space-time. And yeah, I thought it was so good. I wanted to have him on, even just briefly. Let me get this. As I'm sure you guys can tell, I'm a little bit under the weather, and it is affecting my mental clarity. So I'm trying to be the best host I can. But I'll be honest, when I do, this will be heavily edited, when it becomes a when it becomes a audio only show. All right,
Perfect timing.
Hey. Good to see
Okay,
you.
yeah. Sorry about that. To the viewers, I am currently ill and drink a lot of water. So anyway, so any he's not interested. I'm lying.
Jay Ford is saying that you're not interesting.
Interesting. Oh, thank you.
And
Thank you,
then Jacob, Jay Burden is sick, so he can only weakly agree. Yeah, that's pretty
We're
accurate.
all sick here. Anyway, yeah. So, I wanted to mention because in the Substack article I wrote, I kind of documented examples of the theory of evolution before Darwin, and it's rather like surprising how similar it is. There were like Islamic scholars who wrote about man coming from monkeys and how it's part of Allah's creation to add complexity up the form with man being at the top, and this idea that man comes from monkeys is a common theme. One of the things that as I've probably mentioned on a few shows now, I'm in architecture, but I've dabbled with a little of biohacking for fun because I'm interested in it as like a material production method for architecture. And there is this interesting thing when you start looking at the actual DNA of species, and that is that they're not just the information of what the creature is. They're also the information. They're also DNA is also the information what the creature could be and was. By that I mean, for example, in my Substack article, I give examples of birds. Most birds have DNA for a tail, for hands, for the claws you see in dinosaurs that are forward-facing as opposed to their backward-facing claws. They have DNA for teeth that's turned, and these are all sections of DNA that are turned off. DNA has on and off switches, and so there are chunks of the DNA which are just turned off. And what that, if Darwinian evolution was completely true, then we would wonder why is it that pretty much a large amount of the information of what these creatures supposedly were is still there. It's not that the genes were competed out through natural selection, it's that they were just turned off. And this got me thinking because it kind of meant that, well, if I can create a dinosaur by just turning on and off a few genes, then the argument that birds came from dinosaurs is kind of bullshit. It's that birds and dinosaurs are the same thing with different genes turned on and off. Like God made them prepackaged to be either or depending on the conditions in their environment. To some degree, this shows up every day in our lives. We see that in the cities, like for example, birds will get grayer because there's concrete, and on the coasts they get whiter because it's easier to blend in. And so creation's kind of packed in with this redundancy to adapt to changes that mankind might induce. And that kind of, I'll say honestly, that made me a little bit of a young Earth creationist because it meant that, well, if these genes have retained themselves over supposedly 60 million years, then what exactly is it? Can't be natural selection because it's kind of not totally efficient to keep these turned off genes hanging around for millions of years. Like it's kind of like an inefficiency. A mutation might happen and fuck with you, and all kinds of things might happen. So why are they there? It's almost as if they were created to become either or. And that kind of made me wonder a little bit. There are references in a lot of old texts about you might have heard Nephilim and other like supposed like mythical creatures in the Bible that were like giants and such. Many texts say that it wasn't just humans that could be Nephilim. That whatever caused their appearance also happens in other species. Oh, hold on a second.
So do you mean that other species could be Nephilim in the sense that they could just be like massive, or were there other like characteristics that were mentioned in these texts? Oh, I guess Luthemplaer had to leave.
Sorry, it's a busy house.
Oh yeah, no worries, man.
I didn't catch what you said.
Oh, so you said that there was a belief that Nephilim was a trait that could be possessed by more than just humans. So
Yeah.
what would that mean? Just that they were giant, that they were kind of.
If we understand Nephilim as essentially humanity made ferocious, like giant, meat-eating, blood-drinking creatures of horror, and we see that in the past. The past would be immediately after Adam sinned, supposedly, we can say. Then we kind of can, and if we find the genes for this ferocity in pretty much every species, then arguably those ancient texts are probably getting at something that creation comes maybe it wasn't pre-built, but whatever happened after sin, every creature has these genes to basically become very ferocious, to become very horrible. And likewise, they have the genes to be less ferocious. The most common example you can find is the panda bear. This is a creature that cannot really exist in reality, and yet it does. It needs food supply. Like, the panda, if you think about the panda, it's very weird. It's basically a bear that's been devolved or evolved into a kindly, friendly creature that occasionally gets mad. It's almost like the opposite of Nephilim, where it's like, yeah, this thing is basically, you took a omnivorous, like canine like predator and made it this like goofball that can't have kids very well. It's like, how does that happen? Because you can look at a panda's DNA and find like the DNA for a ferocious bear. It's just turned off. and you start looking at a lot of creatures, and this is all true. Like fish have DNA for armor that's just turned off. And if you look at the fossil record, it's turned on. Like they're more ferocious. Why would you have armor unless something's ferocious trying to eat you? And when those things were gone, those genes are turned off.
Well, and it also it does kind of strike at the root of the Darwinian presupposition, right? Of something always getting better.
Yeah.
Because if you have the ability to be more ferocious, right, it seems at the very least like that's something you should keep, like it seems like we should essentially be like eternally breeding like super predators,
Yeah, and much to the opposite of the dark force theory. It's like kind of like the friendly force theory. Like, why is it that creatures have tended to get, at least as far as you can find from the fossil record, they've gotten smaller, nicer, and friendlier. And a lot of the ferocious predators, even in our mythology, Europe used to be full of lions and rather demonic looking lions if you look at the art of them. And now they're just these like kind of like furry goofballs that can be ferocious when they want a meal, but otherwise are like reclining on the savannah doing nothing. I've done a lot of in my Substack article about this. I posted a lot of the experiments that have been done. For example, trying to turn on these dinosaur traits in birds. And I've included photographs of like embryonic studies and what it looks like. It's a good Substack to go through so I don't have to shill it too much. But like, yeah, like you said, like why are the ferocious genes kind of tending to be turned off? Or currently we're in a season where it seems to be turned off. Whatever caused this, creatures tend to be less ferocious nowadays. At least if you look at the genes, there are clearly genes to be more ferocious. And again, ferocious and scary from what we would say from a human perspective.
So it's interesting because I see in the chat someone talking about sloths. Like, I hope sloths make it. There's a whole subspecies, or there's not a whole subspecies is the wrong term. There's a whole like species of essentially massive cave sloths, which were these like, they were like the size of like a cow essentially, and they were like these again like hyper aggressive, like hyper, I guess, dangerous sloths. And so it is just kind of fun. Like if you ever want to just waste time, just like click around Wikipedia.
Oh yeah. If you look at saber-toothed tigers, here's a black pill. The shape of a saber-toothed tiger matches the shape of a child in that time period.
Jeez.
And it's kind of curled to grab a kid and run off and eat it. But yeah, I mean, so to summarize, what I'm arguing based off like the medieval model, that Luther somewhat talks about in his Genesis commentary, things evolve, but they don't seem to generate new traits. It's more like they're alternating between potentials. It's like almost as if we're talking about 60, 80 million years, 120 million years back. These genes are still in there. You can basically say that they've always been there. It's almost as if they were created with the possibility of becoming ferocious or nicer. And it's not so much that they've progressed in their traits like a Darwinian or Whig theory. It's that they've just had different seasons. Like in some seasons they need to be more ferocious, in some seasons they don't need to be. And the genes just kind of select themselves to turn on and off. And what causes these genes to turn on and off is epigenetics, you've heard of probably. Like environmental factors will just make some things turn off. I'm not a perfect scientist about this. I kind of know it. Like and it is possible to lose these traits. Like a large portion of the human family, that's a liberal term. A large portion of the human family lacks the lactose gene. Like they can't digest milk, right? I think it's not so much that it's lacking as that it's just turned off. Check me on that one. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure the people that lack the ability to drink milk, it's not so much that they lack the gene, it's that the gene's just turned off for them, for whatever reason. And so like you look at, after you look through the DNA of like a dozen species and found these same tendencies, you kind of start questioning the Darwinian model that natural selection produces new genes, and start wondering maybe these have always been here and like they were created that way, and they just, it's evolution isn't so much the production of new forms of life but so much as the adaptation of what you already have to what you need.
It's interesting you brought up epigenetics, right? Because a while ago, this was probably 4 or 5 months ago, I had Heroic Will on my podcast for the second time. And he spoke about human epigenetics. And he basically said that there's increasing research that on kind of an individual level, like you and I, can essentially change the epigenetic features in the next generation, right? That simply by virtue of the fact that like on a very, very short time scale, and admittedly, this was an athletic context. So by being, physically fit and by being active, even if you are, heaven forbid, not involved in your child's life, you dramatically increase their ability to keep those traits moving forward.
Yeah, and a lot of the famous secular and pagan scholars in these circles talk about this to some degree. Like what is the term biospirit gets carried around a lot. Like why are Africans more breeders and fighters and Europeans less so, or more commonly nowadays, why is it that like for the last half century, white men in Europe are getting lower and lower testosterone levels, right? Like where did that come from? That there's no change in the genes. It's more like something's been turned off, and over the course of several generations, it perpetuates itself being turned off. And you can say that there's like microplastics or birth control in the water, and there's a lot of like go-to answers, but it may be something else just in the culture that changed that, or behavioral change that made white men stop having testosterone, basically.
So there, and I'm sure you've seen this, right? Because you're an educated man, that there are few ideas as toxic in like mainstream academia as either, and these are linked, as either cyclical history or decline, right? Things must either always be the same or always be getting better. But the idea that anything could be worse, especially people could be worse, is just anathema.
Yeah, I would say that view is starting to fall away as reality starts creeping in. But when I was at Columbia, there was still these like 90-year-old Holocaust survivors saying, "Oh, we've defeated the great evil. It can only get better from now." And while they're saying that, Afghanistan.
Well, and I agree with you on a political level, but when it comes to things, even like a common expression, like, did you see that that calendar going around, and it was kind of just like idyllic, like watercolors of the British countryside, and there was some kind of like leftoid basically saying like, "Oh, this is a fake version of reality. This is fascism incarnate." Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw it, and there are plenty of like videos and photographs, if you don't believe a painting, that prove that they're bullshit, that they're bullshitting you about that.
But and while I completely agree with you, my point is that there is this kind of like almost religious presupposition.
Yeah. The
things
past,
like
go, sorry.
The past must either be the same or worse. And weirdly enough, I think you see this in fantasy, right? Where specifically someone like Martin, right? J.R. Like Martin, the guy who wrote, the Song of Ice and Fire, cannot imagine medievals who don't live like modern people, who don't act like modern people.
Yeah.
And this idea that humans or any organism could be truly kind of like radically different in a different time is kind of anathema. So that was the point I was trying to get at.
No, it's very true, because there were degenerates in the medieval era too, as there always are a few, but there were few, and they were often locked away in a monastery and forced to do penance for it. And you can, there's the argument from the negative where if you find a law about it, it was a problem, right? there's almost no law regarding, for instance, sodomy in between the fall of the Roman Empire to the 1200s. It's like kind of exists, but you can't really find it in many legal codes being enforced, at least. And then all of a sudden, around the time of the Crusades, it gets really bad, and like people start like reinforcing these laws. And so for a fact that because these laws passed away by the wayside, while they were still warning about, there were still preachers warning about Sodom and Gomorrah, you can kind of work out the fact that, okay, maybe people were ignoring it, but I find it hard that an entire continent of like 400 million people or something, or maybe 200 million people, were just like ignoring this one sin. It seems more likely like it was just not common.
Well, right, and then there's kind of a revisionist take on that really the reason that they didn't punish anyone for it is that the medievals were actually super tolerant, that they had awesome Viking gay sex.
Yeah. Meanwhile, you find like people again. You do find people getting thrown in the monastery once they're found out, however rare it is. Like,
I also realized that if there was ever going to be a clip from this show that gets like taken out of context, that one's going to be it.
Yeah, I mean, the medievals were so tolerant that they went on a crusading war across the continent.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's obviously absurd.
Several times, mind you. But yeah, I mean, like, awesome Viking. Oh no.
sorry, carry on. Say something to bail me out of this hole, please.
I can't. I'm too sick to figure out. But yeah, I mean, like so. I guess we've established that like the Darwinian Whig view is suspect, in so much as I can lay on more examples of this. Like, why is it when you look at like fossils in amber, for example, you don't really find anything that isn't alive today? People have argued that like, oh, it's because those are like locked in niches in biology, that once something gets there, they're just there forever. But there were several extinction events where those creatures had to compete for that space again. People forget that the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous each had their own extinction event. As a matter of fact, I think the Jurassic extinction event was more intense than the Cretaceous one, and dinosaurs had to just completely retake what they were holding on to, biologically speaking. And there's this interesting, like, yeah, you can find different looking things in amber, like an ant with like, I think it's called the devil ant or something, where it has this like enormous prong to stab things with, but still an ant. And you can still find ants with weird head decorations today. Like, we found this like feather of a dinosaur in the amber. Yeah, but it's still a feather. All right, it's still a bird. It's still the same thing that's around today. I've gotten to the point where I just don't view dinosaurs and birds as different species. They're probably, those dinosaurs were just currently existing species with different genes turned on, and they just epigenetics did it, not genetics. And I that's gonna make me like sound like some bitter old like 6,000-year-old creationist, but like, I mean, like, I don't care. It's just the reality of what I see when I look at the DNA.
So here's one thing I'm kind of fascinated by, is that I've heard an argument on both the left and the right that essentially Darwin, instead of kind of like receiving this kind of like scientific revelation, was in fact effectively just applying kind of classical economics to biology. Do you think that there's any truth in that?
Yeah, I've heard this in my PhD program when I was there. There are a lot of people in academia now questioning Darwinism but not evolution. Well, they'll be like, oh, Darwin was a capitalist. He never really wrote about symbiotic relationships in nature. It was always vicious competition. And so there's a lot of people trying to develop new models of biology, like a biont, I think they call it, or something, like different like models of biology where, this has a lot of the political baggage of the people writing it, where they're trying to question individuality. They're trying to question, are you a body if like 60% of the cells in your body aren't human? Shut up. I don't care. But you see this a lot where like, oh, the human is only like 30 or 40% of the human body, and the rest is just like microbes in your belly and skin cells and everything. Cool. They're still competing on the surface of my skin and intestines. And in fact, if my diet changes, one specimen will become more powerful than the other one, basically. Like, your diet controls a lot of the a lot of these cells that are the champions. What you eat determines what cells are most prolific. Sorry, I'm sick. Prolific in your intestinal tract. Anyway, most people know that already.
So one of the kind of like objections to evolutionary thinking that I think is actually kind of valid is this idea that it demysticizes humanity, right? That it makes humanity like just another beast. Do you think that there's anything to that?
I've definitely seen it. Like, and again, this is kind of like a, in the same way, if bad thing happened, God not real. This is kind of like, well, if you're 60% the same as a banana, you're not very advanced, are you? You're not very superior, are you? Again, most of your genome is turned off. Most of your genes are deactivated. There's only a handful of genes that are actually running you. The rest of them are for like alternative situations when they're needed. Some of them turn on in your lifetime, depending on what's needed. Some of them never turn on in your lifetime. You just pass them on to the next generation. Like there's DNA in your body to deal with if you smoke pot, and if you never smoke pot, those genes are never used. They're just there, and then they get passed on to the next one. This is like again, it's basically an argument of, well, you're mostly a banana, so you're not really like superior. It's like arguing the British Empire, let's say the British Empire and the Aztecs were both mostly people. Therefore, the British Empire wasn't so interesting or important. This is dumb. This is just dumb.
Well, right, and it, to me, I guess I don't entirely understand the point behind the argument, other than to just be kind of irritating. Because it's like, well, okay, technically you might be right. Just like technically a tomato is a fruit. But like short of just being pedantic, I don't really see the point in it.
Most of these arguments are primarily designed to throw you off what you want to argue, and they're just distractions. I'm gonna go off a tangent here, but one of the best books I ever read was Blind Sight, and in this book, which is, and this might be a future stream, but humans are making first contact with this alien species, and the aliens can generate perfect speech to speak like, they've translated our language. And it's later figured out that they're just like, they're basically speaking like AI speech, right? Like pre-generated texts. They're not actually speaking intelligent languages. And one of the ways that the scientist figures this out is that she kind of messes with the algorithm that they're talking to. She says like, oh yeah, our cousin the Neanderthal on the family tree says hi, and this is a ridiculous statement. But the aliens just took the data in and spit out, oh, tell him we said hi too. We hope he's doing well. Like it's like you. I agree completely. And eventually it's discovered that the reason why the aliens are using an algorithm to speak to humanity rather than speaking directly to them is because they're not actually conscious. They're actually not a conscious alien. They're intelligent, but they're not conscious. Spend your time figuring out how that works on your own time. But and it turns out that when the aliens started listening in on humanity, they got such a dump of useless junk information, like texts about dating someone, or like the current status of some random countries, like demographics. That might be useful, but like just endless junk DNA from humanity's like social media, that they interpreted it as an act of war. They interpreted humanity's like junk conversation, like small talk, as aggression, as like the amount of information you're pumping out in the universe is such a weighty nothingness that our own spaceship and people are wasting away our potential trying to interpret it. Like, if you're not a sentient being and you don't care about romance and all that other nonsense, then if you're spending like hours decoding a message and it's just how someone is describing their date, you're kind of going to feel like, did I just get attacked by a virus? Did I just waste my energy translating this to like, it's like a waste of time. This is the way these people kind of debate that we're talking about, where they're kind of pumping you with nonsense arguments purely designed to distract you and waste your time, because they don't want to talk about the things that actually matter. Essentially, you have to just walk over them. The famous line from that book is, "How do you say hello when saying hello is a declaration of war?" Right. So it's a great line.
Do you think that? Because I'm kind of fascinated by this as just like an anthropological thing, like kind of as just a cultural phenomenon. But do you think that like the truly, I guess like the truly like low IQ, young Earth creationist take, like the Ken Hams of the world, even if I don't necessarily agree with them, I kind of understand them in a weird way. That they were dealing with a conversation that wasn't really about the topic at hand. It was kind of a proxy for kind of like dumping on the religious right and kind of like pushing those people like out of their spot in the sun. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I would call myself a young earther now, but I would also question if it's exactly 6,000 years. I don't know. Like the Bible skips genealogies all the time, and Jesus' genealogy, so who knows? But nonetheless, I don't buy the 13 billion model either. But anyway, to get to your point, I kind of view them as they were the ascendant normal American culture, like the stock beliefs. And if you ever want to create social change, the first thing you do is you attack the things that are cherished and well held as like the kind of societal, it's a societal mythology of where they came from. And in order to replace it, you have to first topple it or make people question it. Yeah, the Scopes monkey trial was basically two wrong sides trying to decide which wrong they're going to believe. It wasn't actually about truth. It was about, these dumb Christians refuse to accept the science. I mean, like, half the science that they believed back then turned out to be bullshit anyway. They still thought they thought a lot of things. But anyway, yeah, it's one of those arguments where it was a low hanging fruit and a really, really easy way to get a generation of kids to question their elders. And what followed immediately from the Scopes monkey trial through the 1970s and like all these like flooded belief systems was of course the new atheists who took the kids and turned them all into crazy people. Some of them will come back, of course, but yeah.
So I'm curious, right? What is your, and I realize you got into this with Charlemagne, but what is the reason that you don't buy that 13 billion number?
I talked about with Charlemagne where the metrics by which you use to arrive at that number are assuming constants don't change, and I've seen a lot of evidence that constants do change, be it the speed of light or the decay rate of molecules. The famous example, I think, out of Stanford a few years ago, this is probably a decade ago, but they found that every time a solar flare hits the Earth, atomic decay accelerates a little bit, just briefly. And of course, if you don't first know how long the Earth has been around, then you don't know how many times it's been hit by a stellar flare. And if you don't know how many times it's been hit by a stellar flare, then you just can't rely on carbon dating, other than to say this is one thing's older than the other. Because if everything's being accelerated at the same rate from the solar flare, then okay, everything's going to age. So like if it says it's older, but you don't know I said earlier, like the range, but not the location of the numbers. So like, instead of 13 billion to 14 billion, it might be something like 10,000 to 20,000. The range might be the same scale, but not the same location on the number scale, if you will. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
No, you are. So in our last couple conversations, when we spoke about the three body problem, and one of the ideas in that, and something that you and I, discussed at length, is this idea that technology is or could be frozen. There's kind of a hard limit to what science can understand. Do you think that this relationship to constants and the belief that either constants are truly universal or that they need to change, do you think that kind of factors into the hard edge of human understanding?
Yeah. The famous example that I always say is that there were variations in the speed of light, and then I think around the 70s or 80s they just decided this is the number, we don't care, that's the number we're going to use, we're no longer going to measure the speed of light. And of course, you can measure the speed of light now, but it still kind of comes off by 1 or 2 kilometers a second every once in a while. So if it's changing over time, let's say it changes 1 or 2 kilometers a second every 100 years, you wouldn't yet have been around measuring it long enough to notice that, right? Like you've only been measuring the speed of light for maybe 300 years, and you do see variations before it was locked in. oh, what if it's still changing? What if it's still going down in speed? What if that just has been something that's always been, and that's actually just a gradual change in the universe, and you don't know? Because you haven't been looking long enough.
Right. No, that's an interesting idea. Because again, it's almost like a desire. And I was talking, I had a Twitter space that turned into kind of a disaster with Oros yesterday. Not due to him, but just due to me not understanding the platform. And we were kind of talking about mathematical models and graphs, right? And models are a useful tool in the sense that they enable you to kind of simplify reality into a meme, something you can share quickly and easily. But the problem is there's this kind of like autistic desire to make the perfect model, to account for everything or to make reality fit the model. And I noticed it all the time, whenever I was doing econ stuff, like you see this in the finance world all the time. It's like we have a formula that will tell us how much this stock is worth. And you can do all the work for it. It's quite complicated. And then you look at it and it's not worth that.
Yeah.
Well, and why is that? Well, effectively, it's because your model isn't real. And again, I think that especially when you see this kind of like growth of expertise and growth of an institution and an organization around a field, it just becomes calcified. You take these things as laws almost.
The question that people don't like to answer is like, even if you believe in evolution, is religion an inherent part of your brain? And if it has to have an existence, then you can't just deny that, right? Like you can't like this, if today the new science said that eating meat, eating meat is toxic, terrible, and it will kill you. We're never going to eat meat again. It doesn't change the fact that your body needs it, right? And in the same way that like you might want to deny religion, but it doesn't change the fact that your brain is wired to be religious. And so once you remove the religion you were believing, you have to find something else to believe, and most people turn out to be science. There's one of my favorite quotes by John Michael Greer is like, if you come to the tomb where Nietzsche buried God, you'll probably hear the gravediggers burying progress there too, or something to that extent. And it's a great quote because it's like, like progress became the new religion. Progress is assumed to be as eternal as God. And if you hit a limit to that progress, well, you must be wrong, or you're not working hard enough, or something's off. There can't be an end to progress. How could that possibly be? And at the same time, well, what if there is? What if there really isn't that much more left to know, and that's the end, right?
Yeah, and again, it does go back to that almost in a way that as like, Darwin is this kind of like founding saint of science, quote unquote, the science, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's that precept of like perfectibility, that like things are getting better and better and better, is baked in at a level that was almost like too deep to tear out. It's kind of like the foundation on which the whole like doctrine is built on.
Yeah. And because, if you were in like the 1800s, it really did look like science can never end. Like there's always something new to discover. But even now we're kind of realizing the hard limits of that. All of science depends on taking data by means of using the photon. The photon is the means by which all data is taken. You want to know what something is, you shoot a photon at it, it gives you data. You want to know something specific, change the frequency of the photon to be something that will interact with the thing you're trying to measure. Of course, that assumes that there's nothing smaller than a photon. And if there is something smaller than a photon that you simply can't interact with, maybe that's what all this quantum physics stuff is. The little bit of uncertainty in an otherwise deterministic universe might just be a deterministic particle that's too small to see, and you just wouldn't be able to interact with it, and you never will see it until you find some means to like infer it. And maybe there isn't any way to infer it, in which case it will just always be the random chaos in your system that is deterministic, but you simply never have a means to measure it.
Okay, so I very rarely do this, because I look at my audience with a combination of just pure disdain and resentment, right? But in all seriousness, right, I see we're getting some pushback on this idea of a limit to progress. And so specifically, right, like if we're here, in this sphere, the kind of like being on the radical right, we're involved in questioning premises, right? And like deeply held premises, right? Like I know it counts as kind of like rote on this side of the internet, but like the idea that democracy is not the be all end all, that's a pretty big premise to question. But the problem is it's like when you start pulling at that thread, you have to keep going.
Yeah.
And there are more things buried in that than just democracy or in just universal suffrage. And you can't, much like we kind of consistently make fun of, like the James Lindsays of the world for wanting to stop at, 90s liberalism or 1950s conservatism. Like if you're actually committed to the truth and committed to like what really is, then like just you have to keep going. And to me, right, at least this idea that progress is eternal, that's not a scientific fact, that's an ideological presupposition.
Yeah, throughout history, you can find this wobble between tyranny and democracy all the time. It's not really a Whig model that things have always gotten better. It's more of a cycle where some years democracy is favored, some years tyranny is favored, and for all you know, this is just a product of epigenetic cycles that happen in every few generations, where whatever comes out from the democratic model produces the epigenetics to create a tyranny model, and whatever comes out of a tyranny model produces the epigenetics that favors a democratic model, and you might just be stuck in that cycle forever. And that just might be yin yang kind of stuff. But and if you look at history, that's kind of what it looks like. It may very well be a more accurate model than this idea of mankind always getting better. I mean, if that was true, then like why did the Roman Senate end? Why did tyranny take over? Why did the Caesars take over? And likewise, after the Caesars, when Europe became this pseudo kind of like, they call themselves kings, but they operated like republics basically. Before absolute monarchy, the kings were just like sort of an elected official by the nobility, and it was somewhat of a democratic model, actually, honestly, but it was like a limited democracy. And then of course the divine monarchs came back, and then democratic reforms came back, and now we're heading more towards a tyrannical model. This seems to be a consistent history going back as far as history can record it. I can show you examples in ancient Babylon and in Egypt where like there are moves towards democracy, there are moves towards tyranny. I'll put it this way, there's a reason why the third pyramid of Giza is smaller, because that pharaoh wasn't a dictator. He was interested in releasing some of the tyranny of his fathers, and so he couldn't instruct the will of the people to build a pyramid big enough. And so his pyramid's smaller, not because he was poorer or he was weaker, but because he just didn't do what his fathers did. He didn't want to be a tyrant, and as a result, no one wanted to work for him. And so like the epigenetics of the first two pyramids, like those are like two generations of people building stuff that just burned out, and the third pyramid was smaller. It could have been as big as the third one, but the epigenetics of the time changed towards a more localist model. You had the and again, like after the pyramid era, you had after the era of pyramids in that era, there was the intermediate period, and then the Middle Kingdom. They focused on temple construction. Almost every surviving pyramid actually comes from a brief 200 to 300 year era of Egyptian history. There are pyramids after that, but they're just not as big. They're not as interesting. They're not as complicated. They're kind of like mockuaries of the previous era. And after that, Egypt only did temples, and that was it. And then later on in the Greek era, they did libraries and social issues. It became more democratic, and the priests and the pharaohs or later the Roman governors were expected to provide for the people in a more social model. These things go back for all of human history, the sway between tyranny and democracy.
Yeah, and I guess that I should temper what I said earlier about humans getting worse, right? Because I do firmly believe in a relatively fixed human nature, right? I think you can be a better or worse man, or you can be, in a better or worse civilization, right? But I think that there's kind of a flattery in believing we're unique, and obviously, like from a certain perspective, like technologically we are, right? But nonetheless, right, you do kind of see these cycles, and I think that there's been a broader conversation about kind of cyclical history in our spheres that's been kind of interesting. But I didn't know about the cycles in Egypt at the very least.
Yeah, there's three distinct eras of Egypt, and they tend to get more socialist over time. Same with Rome, like what?
Oh, no, I was just going to read a super chat because Corbin brought up something very real, which is all pyramid building is tyranny unless I consent, which is 100% true, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, man, you were saying something before I brought that up.
Yeah, I know the in-joke of that one. But yeah, so you find this in almost any civilization. The Gracchi brothers of ancient Rome were socialists, communists. If you look at what they were arguing, it's basically communism. And then it shifted to more a capitalist model, and it shifted more towards a tyrannical Caesar model. And there, as the scriptures say, there's nothing new under the sun. I would go so far as to say the only thing new in our era is basically electricity. So there's something new. All the new things in the world that we have is primarily from the discovery of controlling electricity. And it's not that people in the past couldn't to some degree do that. Like, there are these old batteries that were used in Iraq to coat gold onto metal because the electrostatic power clung the gold to the surface. So there were like small little bouts of electricity, but there just wasn't the arrangement of minds to see the industrial application beyond like decorations, basically.
Well, that's really interesting. I think that we're both, a little bit under the weather, so we should probably bring this thing to a close. But anyway, man, where can people find you and listen to more of your work?
I did that show with Charlemagne. That was pretty fun. It's like a test stream, but it ended up being astrophysics themed. Still getting some pushback from that one, but I try to reply. But Luthemplaer.substack is the Substack I write. And then, of course, I run the Restoration Bureau. Been a little lax recently on posters because I keep getting sick, but we'll see if I can get back on schedule with that stuff. Probably won't be one tonight, but and then what? I guess I hang around Telegram chat and Twitter. Twitter is the same name as you see there, and I bully people on Twitter with AI voices.
And anyway, guys, you know where to find me. These episodes go up on YouTube. They also go up on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you listen to audio only shows. And I'm also recently started adding all of my episodes to Odyssey, right? I'm trying to push more onto alt tech. I feel like, one way or another, our days here are numbered. And so it'd be nice to, build some resiliency. If you do want to support the show, I don't expect it, but I do appreciate it. And if you support me on, Substack, on Subscribestar, Patreon, anywhere you want to, I will accept it. You get access to pre-recorded episodes early. And so currently that means you could listen to an episode I had with Chris Gard and another one that came out just today where I talked to Fritz Imperial. And those episodes will eventually come out on the main feed, so don't feel like you're missing out. It's just a little bit of a perk, for the people that support me. And again, thank you so much, Luthemplaer, for coming out.
Yeah, have a good one.
All right. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.